afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to get some food. It's really delicious. I ate too much. I'm sure other people did too, at least I hope so. So, my name is Sharon Parrington, and it is my pleasure to moderate the second session of our Graduate Student Symposium. Before we begin, though, in your programs, I have to announce a slight change. Myrna Morales and Katie Seitz were not able to attend today, so we are going to have 3 presentations instead of 4. But what 3 wonderful presentations we're going to have. Our 3 panelists today, Kazia Berkley-Cramer, Niki Marion, and Stacy Collins, will challenge us to explore the connections between libraries, literature, and social change. Kazia, Niki, and Stacy are pursuing master's degrees in children's literature here at Simmons College, and Kazia and Anastasia are also pursuing a dual master's in library and information science. So over the course of this session, they're going to direct our attention towards the societal norms embedded within children's and young adult literature. After all 3 presenters have finished, we're going to open up the floor to questions, but until then, I'm going to ask you just to listen. So Kazia is going to be our first presenter. So she combines her interest in feminism and pop culture, and her research often focuses on the way that gender, childhood, and family structure are represented in children's and young adult literature. Today, Kazia will provide a feminist and queer analysis of Lemony Snicket's The Bad Beginning.
Okay, so can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So my talk is The Marvelous Marriage, Gender, Feminism, and Heteronormative Ideologies in The Bad Beginning. How many people have read The Bad Beginning and or the rest of the series? Okay, cool. So this is based off of a final paper I wrote for a class last semester. And I looked specifically at the first book in a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. And for those who don't know, I'm just going to give like a really quick rundown of the plot, so when I mention characters, you won't be quite so confused, hopefully. So Violet, Klaus, and Sunny Baudelaire are 3 siblings who at the beginning of the book find out that they've been orphaned when their parents die in a fire. Then their parents' banker, who is kind of like a really strange social worker, Mr. Poe, takes them to live with their supposed relative, Count Olaf, who turns out to be a terrible, horrible, super gross creeper. It's like the worst of the worst. And they basically, he tries and tries and tries to get their fortune, which they inherited from their parents. And they spend the whole book trying not to die living with him. So that's basically what happens. So my presentation focuses on the 2 eldest siblings, Violet and Klaus, and the way that Snicket creates a text that presents both progressive and conservative ideologies about gender and family structures. So I argue 3 main points. First, you can come in if you want to. Okay. First, that it's a clearly feminist text that breaks away from traditional gender roles with its 2 protagonists. Second, that the book is also a clearly feminist text in its portrayal of the threat of sexual violence to Violet. And third, that it reinforces the importance of heteronormative family structures through Violet and Klaus's constant struggle to keep their family together. So, throughout The Bad Beginning, Violet and Klaus subvert expectations of traditional gender behavior. Unlike many so-called feminist girl characters in children's literature and our culture more broadly, Violet does not explicitly reject all things feminine. She's not some uber tomboy. However, she is interested in fields that happen to be stereotyped as masculine. She likes mechanical engineering. She thinks of herself as an inventor, and she's a very strong action taker in the book. And these are all things that are stereotypically masculine in our culture. In her book, Waking Sleeping Beauty, Roberta Seelinger-Treitz notes that in the process of maintaining her personal strength, a feminist female character often subverts traditional gender roles, playing on stereotypes and stretching their limits by incorporating characteristics that are associated with both genders in her actions. For example, let's look at Snickett's first description of Violet. He says, "Anyone who knew Violet well could tell she was thinking hard because her long hair was tied up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. Violet had a real knack for inventing and building strange devices, so her brain was often filled with images of pulleys, levers, and gears, and she never wanted to be distracted by something as trivial as her hair." Here, Snicket is explicitly rejecting traditional patriarchal ideas that what's important about an adolescent girl, or girls and women of any age, is their appearance. She uses a feminine tool, a ribbon, to keep away her long hair, which is also a symbol of traditional femininity. So here we have a feminist character who is able to engage in both stereotypically masculine acts while also retaining her feminine identity. But despite Treit's focus on female characters, we know that male characters can be feminist too. And that's definitely true of Klaus, who's Violet's younger brother. He's a researcher and a reader, which in comparison to Violet are more passive and stereotypically feminine traits. He's also more of a nurturer, frequently shown holding Sunny and comforting her. Sunny's the baby sister when she's upset. But interestingly, that's all described in the text. But when we see illustrations, these are all from the paperback and hardcover editions, and Violet is always the one shown holding Sunny. So despite Klaus being given this role as nurturer in comparison to Violet, here we're shown constantly that Violet, the sort of female mother stand-in, is actually the nurturer. So we have this sort of contrast and conflict between what the text says and what the images show. And even the image on like the far right, where they're about to be told that, that their parents have died and they're on this beach, the text doesn't describe Sunny being held by anyone. So this is a total sort of choice by Brett Hellquist, the illustrator. So it's interesting to explore sort of the differences there. And another interesting example is here, where this is from the paperback edition. And one of the things that the Baudelaire siblings have to do when they live with Olaf is basically become his servants / slaves and like clean his house, and he lives in a really, really, really disgusting house. But the text doesn't describe like the specific tasks assigned to each kid. And here, Brett Hellquist has yet again sort of gone with gender stereotypes. Violet, who we know is an inventor, is mechanical, is practical, is doing sort of the less theoretically skilled labor of scrubbing the floor, which is also a more feminine task of sort of house cleaning. While Klaus, who we know is sort of the kid who researches everything, and then Violet like puts that into action, he's the one who's actually physically repairing the window, which takes, you know, more mechanical skill. So again, there's sort of this disparity between like realistically which one of those two would be repairing the window. It probably wouldn't be Klaus. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, is sort of this disparity. But back to Klaus for a minute. He's also more outwardly expressive of his emotions than Violet. He's often the first to sob or express outrage. He also thinks more about his appearance than Violet, or at least we get more about him thinking about his appearance. In the book, there's a quote that says, "Klaus looked distastefully at each of the ugly shirts Mrs. Poe had bought for him as he folded them and put them in a small suitcase. Violet looked around the cramped, smelly room in which they had been living." So here, Violet's assessing their living situation, sort of reflecting on the squalor in which they had lived, and Klaus is like, oh man, all of my possessions burned in this fire, and what they gave me is really ugly shirts. And again, later, they are forced into performing in The Marvelous Marriage, which is this play that Olaf wrote to try and get Violet to marry him so they can get the fortune. It's really creepy, and I'll talk more about it later. But there's also a really great quote that says, Violet realized in horror that the dress she had changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed in one of the mirrors, astonished at how ugly he looked. So here, you have Violet, who's been forced into this bridal gown, is being forced into marriage, and what she is upset about is not how she looks in the gown, but the fact that she's in the gown at all. She's this 14-year-old kid who's being forced into marriage with this super creeper. And Klaus is again like, oh man, this sailor outfit is super unflattering. So, you know, and that's not necessarily unrealistic for a 12-year-old boy to be like, oh man, my outfit's gross. But there's this sort of interesting flip where stereotypically women are portrayed as the ones who care about their appearances and really like think about that a lot, and men are sort of not portrayed in that way. So again, Snicket really flips what's going on with gender here, and there's this sort of tension between what you expect them to care about and what they actually do sort of focus on. So I think that's really interesting. But the beauty, I think, of their gender behavior is that it's not actually extreme. In his article, What Then Does Beatrice Mean?, T-San Hugh notes that gender categories are rendered meaningless for the Baudelaire children, who express the freedom and agency to strip themselves of the prescriptive cast of gender's historical enactments. Violet's neither a stereotypical tomboy nor a stereotypically feminine teenage girl. Similarly, Klaus is neither obviously feminine nor hypermasculine. Neither explicitly reject behavior and traits associated with their gender identities. Rather, they demonstrate flexible, fluid, and realistic representations of gendered children. As Trites notes, successful feminist characters are those who adopt the best traits of both genders to strengthen themselves personally and within their communities. And this is something that's clearly true of the Baudelaires. They each use their strengths to confront Count Olaf and attempt to maintain their family unit, protecting themselves and their siblings, and that's something I'll talk more about later. Violet uses action, and Klaus uses knowledge to confront Count Olaf, but both are given equal respect and importance in the book. Furthermore, they're interdependent, for although it's Violet who actually does an action to really save them at the end, she couldn't do what she did without Klaus's knowledge that he shared with her. So, on to my second point. Klaus and Sunny are both in constant sort of threat of physical danger from Count Olaf and his acting troupe/troop of henchmen, because they're the same. But Violet's in double jeopardy as an adolescent girl. Klaus and Sunny both have their lives explicitly threatened multiple times, but Violet not only has this threat, but also has the added threat of sexual violence. Now, I want to make it clear, this is in no way to say that boys and young children of any gender don't experience sexual violence in the home, but in this particular scenario, Violet has a threat that isn't existent for her siblings. So here I'm just talking about this. So while it's never explicitly stated, there are multiple instances of Olaf and his henchmen commenting upon her attractiveness, Violet's attractiveness, to them, while also verbally threatening her and her siblings' safety. For example, Count Olaf reached out a hand and stroked Violet's hair. Would it be so terrible to be my bride, to live in my house for the rest of your life? You're such a lovely girl, and after the marriage, I wouldn't dispose of you like your brother and sister. Yeah. This is their guardian. So while again, there's no explicit threat of sexual violence, the combination of commentary on her physical appearance, a man in a serious position of power touching her without her consent, and the threat to the safety of her siblings works together to imply this threat and create a discomfort that's very specific to Violet's adolescent girlhood in this book. There are tons more examples, from Olaf touching Violet's chin in an imitation of the hetero-romantic script that we often see in movies, to Violet being called pretty only by Olaf and his henchmen, to one of Olaf's henchmen calling Violet a blushing bride and confirming with Olaf, yes, boss, of course I understand she's yours, yes, boss. Yeah. So, in her analysis of Francesca Leah Bloch's fairy tale retellings, Elizabeth Marshall notes that Bloch critiques the dominant narrative of domestic private spaces as safe and nurturing to highlight how paternalism is not benign. The Bad Beginning as a whole constantly pushes against dominant ideology, forcing us to acknowledge that the home and traditional family, as defined by the state, are not always safe spaces for children. And it's important to note that even Violet is still legally a child in this series. She's only 14 in the first book, and it's acknowledged actually by Count Olaf that she's only capable of marriage with her guardian's consent. Who's her guardian? Through the marriage plot, we are also pushed to acknowledge that homes can be especially unsafe places for girls and women, and that despite children having legal guardians, those guardians can actually be the cause of the lack of safety in an environment. So now for my third point. Despite this reminder, the home is not an inherently safe space, that heteronormative marriage is not always mutually consented to or safe, and that the patriarchal figures are not inherently good or protected, Snicket reinforces a heteronormative ideology. As Ian Wojcik Andrews notes in his analysis of Arthur Ransom's work, children's literature writers often take a theme or image, like that of the nuclear family, and shape it to both support and subvert ruling class ideologies. This is an image that I really like, that I think sort of emphasizes a lot of what I talked about before. So a thing for you to look at while I speak to you. The Bad Beginnings marriage plot is a clear critique of patriarchal ideologies in which women are goods to be controlled for economic advantage. However, Snicket presents us with an adolescent boy and an adolescent girl whose only goal is to stay together and take care of the baby, their sister Sunny, who they're morally, if not legally, responsible for. And this reinforces ideologies about the importance of maintaining a heteronormative family structure. Now I want to point something out. The Baudelaires are not real people. They've been constructed by people who are living in our universe. Daniel Handler, his Lemony Snicket, was looking to be successful, and his editor was looking to acquire a middle grade series that would do well for the company. And this isn't to take away from the quality of work, because I think it's an incredible series, but I say this to remind you that it didn't just happen that the gender makeup of the siblings is like this. It's very specific in intent. It's also important for me to remind you that heteronormativity doesn't have to be reinforced by romantic relationships or sexual relationships. The fact alone that the goal of the Baudelaire siblings is to not just survive individually or even together, but to maintain this specific family structure of, adolescent boy, adolescent girl, taking care of baby, is enough to reaffirm the importance of this traditionally structured relationship. And it's also not just in this book. That's the goal of all 13 books. So it really hammers it home over and over and over again. But to wrap up, in the Baudelaire siblings, Snicket creates protagonists who are not only feminist in their subtle subversion of gender stereotypes, but also in their equal participation in their family's self-preservation. Violet and Klaus have very different skills, but they use them to equal extents to aid one another in preserving the safety and survival of their family as a whole, in addition to the individual members. Snicket also reminds us that the home is not inherently a safe space and is unafraid to address the potential for sexual assault and abuse, albeit subtly enough that if you're a young child and you're not sort of ready to understand things, you'll just know that Olaf is creepy and you won't really know why he's creepy. However, while The Bad Beginning is clearly laden with progressive feminist ideologies, Snicket also more subtly reinforces traditional ideologies about the importance of heteronormative families. And it's this tension that I think is really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazia. Our next presenter will be Niki Marion. Niki has a fine arts background, and at present she is intrigued by the concept of visual storytelling for children, particularly in the form of wordless picture books. Niki's presentation today will focus on A Wrinkle in Time, and her analysis will combine what she describes as her undying obsession for the novel with her love of revisionist feminist criticism. Thank you.
Bear with me as I get my PowerPoint up here. Alrighty. Like Kazia, this presentation was born out of a final paper for a class that actually all of our panelists took last semester. So apparently we had a good crop of ideas. But I am presenting on the limited subversive potential of Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. And I have the subtitle, According to a Contemporary Feminist Critique, which is largely informed by one article written by Catherine Schneebaum, and also going to be informed by gender studies as well. In 1962, at the time of its arrival on the sci-fi scene, A Wrinkle in Time was pretty subversive in its characterization of women. Science fiction at this time was largely the domain of men, written by men, consumed by men, and had largely male protagonists, who pretty much were one of two main groups. Either they were the sort of masculine, manly action hero, or these sort of brainiac scientists who could figure out sort of any problems that arose. And women, accordingly, served a similarly stereotypical purpose. They were either victims to be rescued, or they were these sort of evil monsters to be vanquished. And generally speaking, the science fiction genre at the time, which I think we can consider to be very progressive and forward-thinking and exploratory, ultimately conformed to these stereotypic gender roles. But A Wrinkle in Time is partially, with a lot of other novels at the time, responsible for breaking down some of these boundaries. Particularly with its main character, Meg Murray. And I use a lot of the Hope Larson's adaptation, graphic novel adaptation, to kind of drive some of these points home visually that I'm going to make. And this is just the first depiction, or one of the first depictions of Meg at the beginning of the graphic novel, which I think will highlight some of the points that I'm going to go through. Meg Murray, as the protagonist of A Wrinkle in Time, kind of subverts the traditional male protagonist as female, but also as an androgynous female. She presents a lot of characteristics that are traditionally gendered masculine. Like, she's very maths and science oriented and is not so much into the humanities. She's very aggressive. She'll defend her family's honor to the point of getting into fights with boys in her grade. She's very impatient and stubborn and combative, and generally all these traits that we traditionally associate with boy heroes. And all of which serve to distance her from a traditional female role. But Meg also embodies certain feminine traits. She still plays with her her little dolls, and she also embodies female traits in a less overt way through her fierce love and devotion to her family, and especially her baby brother, Charles Wallace. And above all else, it's this love and devotion that motivates her actions and her fault, I guess, of impatience and stubbornness and that sort of thing. But Meg is, Meg is not really the only androgynous figure in the text. Her mother really serves as the model for this combination of masculine and feminine characteristics. And I think it's most evident on the left, the sequence of paneling in which Mrs. Murray, who is a scientist and a mother, takes these two very separate professions, really, and marries them in this one passage where she's got one eye on her scientific experiment and one eye on the stew that's boiling over the Bunsen burner in her laboratory. So we really see that sort of marriage of masculine and feminine traits that Mrs. Murray models for Meg. However, Mrs. Murray is usually described in terms of her physical beauty and not her scientific prowess. So she's still sort of designated as a traditionally feminine. And a character who has achieved a balance between the feminine and the masculine in a way that Meg hasn't quite yet. And Catherine Schneebaum will note in her article that Mrs. Murray exemplifies what Schneebaum terms maternal altruism, which is this impulse towards selflessness and self-sacrifice that women present for the good of their families, for the good of the world, and ultimately, in A Wrinkle in Time, for the good of the universe. This is really exemplified in, or the self-sacrifice that Mrs. Murray holds within in the second panel, in which Meg views her mother with the help of a medium, and she sees her mother's true emotional distress that she has kept inside for so long, having lost her husband. They don't know where her father is. It's kind of the quest within A Wrinkle in Time. So we really see to what extent Mrs. Murray is sacrificing for her family and for their functionality. And because Mrs. Murray is established as this ideal female role model, all other female characters and their behavior conform to this ideal standard of maternal altruism throughout the novel, or so Schneebaum argues. And Meg is no exception to that. Though she uses her faults, her quick temper and her impatience, these faults stem from a source of love for her baby brother Charles Wallace, and love becomes the weapon that she uses to overcome the evil that menaces him. And A Wrinkle in Time thus presents maternal altruism in the form of love as the definitive redemption for this all-encompassing evil. And I wanted to show at the moment Meg recognizes that love is her true weapon, that there's this visual shift that Larson undergoes or presents to the reader. In the image on the left, or on the right, sorry, you see Meg kind of as this scruffy, kind of androgynous, almost boyish character, whereas on the left, you kind of see she's softer, she has more kind of feminine characteristics. You see like eyelashes and a defined like pouty mouth almost. So there is that ultimate conformity, even visually, to these sort of feminine standards and stereotypes for the end. But while Meg conforms to this ideal of femininity and maternal altruism, there are still places within the text that push back against these strict delineations of gender and identity, though Schneebaum may argue not to a great enough subversive extent for a modern feminist reader. but I think one of these main pushes back occur in relation to the character of Mrs. Watsit, who, when we first discover her in the text doesn't describe this figure as masculine or feminine. We don't know if it's even human, really. And I reproduced the passage that I'll read right now. Age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied about the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted about a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. So you can see that there's an absence of any sort of gendered pronouns. There's a man's felt hat, but a shocking pink stole, so we have this conflict between perhaps a masculine gendered object and a feminine gendered object. And then we have the designation by Charles Wallace, Mrs. Watsit. We have that gender confirmed. And, oh, sorry, I just lost my place. And on to the next slide. And there is another instance in the text where there is another sort of gender ambiguity or a move beyond these sort of traditional limitations and constructions of gender, and that's Mrs. Watsit's transformation. Now, for those of you who don't know the book, Mrs. Watsit is actually the sort of celestial being that can kind of take on multiple forms, but this transformation reflects her kind of true form almost, but as it's described in the text. So when we finally discover this true identity, we receive another indicator from the text that gender doesn't apply to this new form. And I'm going to read that description. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time, completely unlike a horse. For from the magnificently molded back sprang a nobly formed torso, arms, and a head resembling a man's, but a man with a perfection of dignity and virtue, an exaltation of joy such as Meg had never before seen. No, she thought, it's not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. From the shoulders, slowly a pair of wings unfolded, wings made of rainbows, of light upon water, of poetry. And though this description genders the creature male, the text also expresses uncertainty that traditional gender roles are valid and apply here. Narrative focalization through Meg does not assign Mrs. Watsit a gendered pronoun, which is highlighted in the quote at the bottom of the slide. We see, I don't know if you guys can see that very well. I highlighted it kind of as like weird pinky color. It says she, question mark, he, question mark, it, question mark. So we have that sort of uncertainty about if these stereotypes apply to this creature here. Even though Mrs. Watsit still insists upon being called Mrs. Watsit, but that's a whole other paper, I think. And this is a really climactic moment that a lot of cover artists like to represent. So I have a few images there. And I love the image on the right because it makes absolutely no sense contextually with the book. It just shows this kind of mythical creature and you don't know if you're supposed to be going back in time to Greek mythology or what. It really doesn't apply thematically that much, but it does show this one moment, and it is a very distinctively masculine figure, as well as the image on the right, which has this sort of long flowing hair with this kind of chiseled physique, reminiscent of like classical sculpture. So I just thought that was really interesting in the depictions that are emblazoned on the cover art. They're very distinctively masculine, even though this particular moment tries to, or at least indirectly, allows the sort of gender ambiguity and fluidity. and sorry, it says cover art 1, and there was a second cover art slide that I skipped, so cover art 3. This one I thought was particularly interesting, my personal favorite cover, because it's the one I grew up with, so nostalgia. But this is a much looser interpretation here. We don't have a torso, so we don't see specifically if it's male or female. However, I kind of zoomed on the face, and I think that, at least for me, I read it as a more feminine face because I see that it's almost made up. It's like has a pinker lip, it's got kind of a softer jaw, almost like these sculpted eyebrows. It seems to me still very feminine. But I do think that it's still kind of gender ambiguous because it's bald too, there's no hair, we don't see torso, we don't see anything else. So this is the one that I think best reflects the integrity of the passage in the text, where you can sort of read one or the other. And I have one more slide. And I think this image really exemplifies something that Meg realizes later on about Mrs. Whatsit when she understands that Mrs. Whatsit was indeed once a star that sacrificed its life to combat the great black darkness that's the evil spreading throughout the universe. And when she finally uncovers this realization, Meg comes to this epiphany about Mrs. Whatsit's identity, or perhaps lack of identity. She realizes with a fresh shock that it was not Mrs. Whatsit herself that she was seeing at all. The complete, true Mrs. Whatsit, Meg realized, was beyond human understanding. What she saw was only the game that Mrs. Whatsit was playing. It was an amusing and charming game, a game full of both laughter and comfort. But it was only the tiniest facet of all the things that Mrs. Whatsit could be. So I think it's really interesting that the text highlights that Mrs. Whatsit is only playing a game here. And I think that really draws on, really before its time, Judith Butler's idea of gender performativity. And the fact that Meg recognizes Mrs. Whatsit's ability to transcend these strict limitations of earthly understanding complicates the fact that Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who and Mrs. Which all truly have conformed to Schneebaum's ideal of maternal altruism, because they have self-sacrificed their idea, or their identity as stars for this greater good of the universe. So thus, this veiled acknowledgement of identity performativity, if not gender performativity, complicates this idea of maternal altruism. And there's one more character that I think also potentially subverts gender stereotypes within the novel, and that's the character of Aunt Beast. And Aunt Beast is an alien form that helps Meg recover after a almost fatal escape from a planet shrouded in the dark evil. And so when Meg first encounters Aunt Beast, the creature does not yet have a name or even a gender. As you'll see from the passage above, I must look as strange to it as it looks to me. So Hope Larson also doesn't really give a visual depiction of any sort of gender signifiers, really. There's an image that I didn't include that has the beasts as sort of a group, and they're technically different genders, as we find out later, but they all look the same. They all have these kind of tentacle-like protrusions. So this is also promising of a gender fluidity, and the text could have left it at that, but we do know that Aunt Beast has a name, and though it is an act of self-naming, that act and Aunt Beast's maternal altruistic impulse, which we find out later, she tells Meg that she has to be as an infant again during her recovery. She feeds and bathes Meg for her. And additionally, Aunt Beast chooses her own name through this sort of telepathic cataloging of Meg's vocabulary. And she notably passes on the words mother and monster and father. However, she finally alights on aunt and beast, even though beast had already been used previously within the narrative. And so within her own name, this sort of self-naming process restricts Aunt Beast to this paradoxical feminine stereotype of either maternal angel or the sort of villainous reviled monster. So I thought that was a really interesting dichotomy even within the novel. And I'm going to finish. Great. In conclusion, or perhaps not so conclusively, though Catherine Schneebaum thinks that because virtually all of the female characters in the novel exemplify this maternal altruism, A Wrinkle in Time thus fails to release the female characters from the moral and practical imperatives of femininity. The roles of primary caregiver, housekeeper, and keeper of the moral flame of the family are expected to be filled by the women in the family, regardless of, and in addition to the less traditional goals and ideas she may cherish and pursue. However, I do still think that the novel includes these points of resistance, and that includes this potential for gender ambiguity and other types of ambiguity as well.